Now in this last section, I'm going to pull it all together. I'm going to show you what plays in to your final price. And we're going to start by showing you that there's this equation basically with 5 factors that are going to result in final deal value. And the reason why it's not a price point is I want you to understand through the process of selling your business, as you negotiate the terms, as you get to closing, your FDV is going to be very different than what the initial valuation price point was at the start of your thing. So this is your exit. Your price point of valuation is back at the beginning. Okay, so in the last section we talked about the P&L, right? And the P&L is kind of the fixed dynamics of your company. There's a track record of it. It's pretty commonplace. There's not going to be any questions about how it's measured. You're going to have your revenues measured without question. Your net profit's going to be there, and your officer wages. Now, that is going to, sorry, bump that camera. Now, this aspect right here is going to parlay into the compensation to the owner. And taking the net profit along with cell phone bills, car payments, leasing the building that you actually own as a separate entity within the building that your business is being run. All of those little things are tax advantages that Congress purposely put in place to support and encourage entrepreneurship. Now, when a buyer is looking at your P&L, they're going to want to be able to recognize, okay, hang on a second. I know you buried things inside the expense line, which is fine, but I want to know what they are that are actually compensating you. Because as a buyer, I want to know the total monetary value that this company is putting in your pocket at the end of the day. So we're just going to call that compensation to owner. There's different terms depending on who you're talking to, investment banker, broker, etc. There is a very structured way to call this, and it's called EBITDA. And it sounds like a French word. If you're dealing with a C Corp or S Corp and you're going to be selling shares or even an asset sale, then EBITDA is going to be a lot more important if you have about $500,000 or more of owner compensation in total. But regardless, it's still the same concept. How much money is coming into the pocket of the owner, okay? Now, that is going to be our first shape of our equation, okay? This aspect is the first shape. So the triangle now is going to be the aspect of the multiples and the dynamics of the company. So we talked about the comps or comparable businesses that have been sold similar to yours. Your broker and banker will get that out of a database probably if they haven't personally sold some of these. Then there's going to be the industry M&A activity, and so we've mentioned that. What we haven't talked about yet is the multiple. Okay, this factor called a multiple is basically saying that you take 1 year's worth of owner compensation and times it by a multiple to derive an end price point. So let's say that in your industry that your type of company is selling at a multiple of 2 or 3. And so you're recognizing in your industry that when you sell a company that one of these two terms is going to be times that multiple and get a price point, okay? Now, what is that number? If you're dealing with Main Street businesses less than about $500,000 of revenue, generally it's 1 or 2 as a multiple, typically of owner compensation. Sometimes the multiple is on the revenue. Now, as you get into software and businesses that actually consider EBITDA, then typically you'll have a 2 to 4 multiple in play. Now, wild and crazy is software companies, because software customers can be folded into an existing platform very easily. So if you were selling advertising and suddenly you're bringing in a niche of 30-year-old professional women making more than $80,000 a year, you add that kind of customer type onto an existing software platform, and the buyer is going to get 6 or 7 times profitability by just adding that customer group into their existing platform. And because that 6 or 7 times value, that becomes the multiple. So the seller of the company that had that niche of women can sell his business with his EBITDA times the multiple of 6 or 7 to derive the selling price. Okay, so I'm not going to go into much more than that on this set of curriculum, but there is another video series that does talk about EBITDA more specifically in owner's compensation. But for today, let me get back onto the equation here. So this is tied into the triangle, and so these two times one another is going to get to a valuation, if you will. Now, there are a couple other factors. You're like, wait a minute, what's going to influence? What's the circle here? What's the snowman? And what's the letter N? All right, so now picking your first price point is very important, right? So that's kind of your initial price point right here of what you're going to sell your company, whatever that number is. Take the balance sheet, okay? And on the balance sheet is going to be dynamics that are subject to perspective of the buyer. And we talked about this in the last section, and I'm not going to reiterate it, but it's after due diligence, just realize the buyer is going to want to fudge things to the left or to the right about how you recorded things, and they're going to have a different perspective. So therefore, the balance sheet and the assets that are on there, if you put blue sky or patent value, etc., just know that they're going to come and they're going to try to negotiate that. So this is the circle in that factor, okay? And typically, I didn't mention this on the last section, so I'm going to talk about it right here. What's going to get discussed is assets on the balance sheet, typically your tangible items, typically things that are subject to depreciation, okay? That's separate. You know, a machine used for production is different than actual inventory. So you may have your WIP or work in progress. You may have your finished inventory, and those things are considered assets. So a buyer may have a different value of your inventory and your work in progress and your physical machinery than you do. So just know that. The other thing is the IP, the intellectual property, whether there is or isn't patents, whether it's tribal knowledge, how well if you're going to have the 5 key employees that know the secret sauce in your engineering firm, then are those 5 going to come with the company, or are only 4 going to come with the company? So, and then the accounts receivable. Who's going to get the accounts receivables? Does the buyer get the accounts receivables, or does the seller? Absolutely negotiable, and that's why on this equation it's recorded as a plus or minus depending on the negotiation of the balance sheet. Okay, all right, so now let's talk about the snowman shape. What is going on with this? This is the industry M&A, and let me get into some details about this, of why this is so influential and why it plays into the final the final deal value. Is let's look at the lifespan of what's going on in your industry, okay? And I'm putting these words down because not everybody, let me put it this way. You're an expert in your business. You've been running your business for a period of time. You've been paying your employees, you've been walking home with money, you've been cashing checks, and you know how to sell your company. You know how to sell your services, your products. You know how to run your employees. You know how to make sure the margins are there. You know the secret sauce to your company. Most of the times, as owners, we have a sense of what's going on in our industry, and sometimes we don't know the details. Like, we have a general sense that, let's say in the elder care market, that the wage for caregivers in our state is at a certain dollar amount, and thankfully we're not California where it's handled differently, or Washington State where every caregiver is basically a quasi-employee of the state of Washington. So, you know, if you're living in Idaho and you're running an elder care company, you know that you're just generally aware of what's going on in the rest of the industry, but not necessarily really in detail. Now, what can be happening is, just because we're aware of something in our industry, it doesn't mean that we know what the acquisition and merger activity is. We don't necessarily know who's getting bought, who's getting sold, and what the price points are, and how fast those deals are going. For example, there was a period of time in the software companies where certain sectors were getting bought up. If you created a mobile app that had any kind of gaming for kids, then you were getting bought up. Like Disney would be like, oh my gosh, I've got to have you. And they would just buy up any kind of app that was serving kids. And so for a period of 2 to 4 years, all of that activity was getting bought up. And so as an owner, what does that look like? As an owner, we are thinking that, geez, we keep hearing about Bob or Tom or Dave that got bought by Disney. Well, yeah, well, so did so-and-so, and so did so-and-so. And so, you know, if the industry is on a fast track of growth and you keep hearing about people getting bought out, then your industry is expanding. If you're hearing about a lot of buy-ups, but there's not a lot of startups in your industry, then it's consolidating. Contracting is kind of the old season, right? So here's the trajectory of expanding, here's the timeline of consolidating, and here's the sad area in the life cycle of an industry where there is contracting. Is if you will, when Ford started the Model Ts around 1930, the horse-drawn carriage industry was definitely in the contracting aspect of the life cycle of an industry. So think about your industry, and are you aware of a lot of people starting up in the industry? Is there increasing competition? Are you hearing people getting bought up, or are you aware that your industry is kind of, they're pulling their poncho over their head and they're just hunkering down and they're just trying to survive? If that's the case, then that's probably an industry that's consolidating. So how does that play into the equation? Well, that is kind of the snowman here. Is the snowman freshly built with a corncob pipe and a smile on his face, or is the snowman melting because the industry is contracting? So that's going to add a plus or minus into the equation up here. And therefore, now what is the in? Okay, the in is a magic word. All of this doesn't matter unless you can do the in. And this is where the broker is going to have their greatest value, because the in is going to be critical in understanding who the buyer is. What is the in? It is negotiation. Who's in the best position to be able to know what the buyer's real interest is in your company, and understanding from the buyer's perspective why they want your company specifically. Now remember, back at the first section, we had talked about A buyer, B buyer, and C buyer, and we talked about internal factors and external factors. And these guys rated this high, that low, and they didn't care about that, and they cared a lot about one aspect and not others. Every buyer has a different perspective of your business, and your broker is going to help know which of these buyers it is that's on the line. And the higher they are orientated to your type of business and the profile and the dynamics, then the greater impact negotiating with that buyer is going to have in driving the price up. And so therefore, you add any of these factors in to here, and it's going to take and widen the range of the price point, going from your initial valuation and your initial listing price and trying to drive this price up here to the final deal value. Now remember, in that final deal value, we had 4 dynamics that went inside there, right? And that final deal value is the total monetary impact of selling your business, not just the cash dollar amount. Okay, this has been great. I feel like I've been able to really give you the details that I've wanted to be able to get your best understanding of how a business valuation is done very differently than real estate valuation, and also that have expanded your mind to realize there's another picture out there from the buyer's perspective that you can't control. But by working with a great broker or a great investment banker, you'll be able to negotiate because you'll understand the buyer's perspective. Can you do this on your own? Yes, you can, but there's very few people that can emotionally separate themselves from their company, get into the buyer's shoes, and be able to know what's going on in the buyer. That's just a lot of work, and most of us don't have that ability. So that's why I recommend getting a great broker or a great investment banker and having them do all of the comps for you, do the valuation, and be able to understand what's going on in the industry, what's going on in your geography, and then to be able to, at the end of the day, negotiate the biggest final deal value they can get for you.